Hey all, just creating this video to show you some different forms of reliability and validity. I already recorded this, but in editing it, I totally messed up the file somehow. So now I'm doing it all over again. Yay. Anyways, so I'll start with, so what I was thinking I would do is I'll go over the definitions of the different forms of reliability and validity that I'll be showing you. Um, and then I will show you how I would actually do this in SPSS using a data set from a study that I had published with a colleague about 8, 9 years ago or so, in which we developed a scale to assess grit in children. So yeah, I'll show you like the actual data from that study, and how I would go about testing for different forms of reliability and validity, like I said. So one of those forms of reliability would be test-retest reliability. This is a very simple test, right? Actually, and even a concept is simple, right? It's like if you step on a scale and it tells you 175 pounds and you step off and then you step back on it again a minute later, it should give you the same reading, right? That's the basic concept behind test-retest reliability. Um, in terms of psychological research, you would administer the test to one group of people at time one. Then that same group of people would take that same test like 2 weeks later, a month later, 6 months later, some interval of time, right? And that's test-retest reliability, and that's pretty simple. Um, then we'll move on to coefficient alpha. This is the most widely used test of internal consistency for a given test. Um, and so, yeah, or internal reliability. With Cronbach's alpha, you're really just looking to see, there's the definition there, but you're really just looking to see how well are or how strongly are all the items on your test related to one another. Does your score on item one, let's say, predict how you would score on item two or three or four? And so if you get a value closer to one, it indicates higher internal consistency. Anything above 0.7 is considered acceptable. But you really want to be getting values around like 0.8, 0.9 if possible. Um, and average proportional distance is a method I developed because Cronbach's alpha, one limitation is that if you have a lot of items on your test, you're going to get a high alpha value, even if they're not all that strongly related to one another. So it takes a number of items into account. I just created this method where I looked at the difference in scoring on items. So if you have a 5-point Likert scale, and on item one, you of construct, let's say we're measuring extroversion, and you respond with 5, and then on item two you respond with 1, and then item three you respond with a 3. Um, your scores are all over the place. It wouldn't have very much consistency, and the advantage of this method was it didn't rely on the number of items. Like, so number of items didn't come into play, unlike Cronbach's alpha, but it never caught on. I think it's been cited 8 times over a number of years now. So, oh well for that. And I think that's it as far as reliability goes. As far as validity goes, let me see. I'll be talking about different forms of criterion related validity, which again, these definitions are fairly wordy, but it's just the extent to which your test is actually correlated or related to different outcomes of interest, right? Um, and with concurrent validity, those outcomes of interest or variables that your test should be related to are assessed at the same time, right? Hence the term concurrent. With predictive validity, your test is predicting some real world outcome or behavior in the future. Um, and I'll show you an example of that. So I'll show you examples of concurrent validity and predictive validity. To me, predictive validity is the strongest because you're actually predicting some meaningful outcome in the future with your test. I'll skip over this. I'll show you incremental validity. We developed this grit scale, like I said, but there was an existing grit scale out there. We were able to predict performance on New York State tests for these kids over and above that grit scale, that existing grit scale. So you could think like our test had added value, right? And that's really what incremental validity is getting at. Does your test predict some outcome beyond like the measures that are already out there for that construct? What else will I be showing you? Convergent. If you hear your textbook talks about convergent evidence. Um, in that edition, I was a co-author and I should have changed it just to convergent validity because that's how I discuss it. But anyways, I wasn't the lead author on it, so at any rate, like it was I much prefer just the term convergent validity. But that's just the extent to which your test correlates with other measures or more widely used or more established measures of the same construct. So if you're developing a new IQ test, you'd want it to be correlated with like the WAIS or Stanford Binet, right, which are widely used IQ tests. In this case, like the study I'm going to show you, I'd want scores on our scale to be correlated with a more established measure of grit, which we did. So I'll show you an example of that. And I think that's it. So we'll keep it simple. And I'll go to the SPSS data set. This is probably bringing bad memories back to some people, depending on how much you loved stats. So this was the study. I'll just quickly pull that up. So development of the grit scale for children and adults and its relation to student efficacy, test anxiety, and academic performance. And so we published this in a journal called Learning and Individual Differences. I'll upload this to Brightspace just so you guys can see how a scale is developed and tested, right, or validated. Let me see, 240. Yeah, so we used 249 students in grades 3 through 12. Even the abstract gets at like how we went about testing it for reliability and validity. These were actually students from Whitehall. I don't know if you're familiar with that town or region. But it's up here, right? GSCA demonstrated high internal consistency and retest reliability. So they're directly referring to the different forms of reliability. I say construct validity, but here specifically, the correlations with efficacy and anxiety or test anxiety, that was concurrent validity. Those were assessed at the same time. We figured grit should be related to those variables. Other measures of grit, that's referring to convergent validity. Remember, construct validity is just an umbrella term. It predicted achievement on the ELA and science standardized tests. So that's predictive validity. And then over and above an existing grit scale. So that's incremental validity. And so I'll show you. Here we go. We'll go about testing these things. And it's really simple and straightforward for the most part to test for these things. Once you've collected all this data, right? In this case, you can see these are all the items on the grit scale. So you would have to go, and make sure they were all entered correctly. I think we were still doing this by hand. So you have to type in scores for everybody for all these different variables. But anywho, so let me get to how I would test for I'll start with internal consistency or internal reliability, and specifically Cronbach's alpha. I would go down here to where it says scale and then reliability analysis. And see, I already put the items in here, but otherwise you would just select the items from this side over here, this box, and throw them in here. And then you're just clicking OK. And that's it. So this is my output file. If you remember, that's always with SPSS, you have your data files and your output files where you actually get the results of your stats. Cronbach's alpha was 0.815, so I'd round that up to 0.82, which is good. It's showing that the items on the grit scale were all fairly highly related to one another, which is indicative of internal consistency. That's that. Test retest reliability. I'll show you how that works. So go to correlate. I'll get rid of this stuff. And so there's our scale. Here it's Kerry Eddy grits, but it's the GSCA, the grit scale for children and adults. And this is time 1. This is time 2. And we're just going to throw those over into the correlation box there and click OK. And that's it. So you can see the correlation between scores at time 1 and time 2 was about 0.7. That's pretty strong. And I think the interval was a couple of weeks in this case. So we'd say it has fairly high test retest reliability. How you scored at time 1 was fairly predictive of how you would score at time 2. Let's do some more tests. So as far as concurrent validity, I'll show you how we went about that. So let me go back here. I'll take our grit scale from time 1, the scores from time 1. We also looked at self-efficacy. We figured grit should be related to self-efficacy for self-regulated learning and meeting others' expectations. And we also figured it would have a negative correlation with test anxiety. So I'll throw that in there and I'll just run that. And boom, we're done with concurrent validity. So we found there's a 0.55 correlation between grit scores and self-efficacy for self-regulated learning. That's pretty high. So the higher your grit, the more self-efficacy you had. Same thing with efficacy about meeting others' expectations. So again, with higher grit, you feel like you could meet others' expectations. And again, these are forms of self-efficacy related to like learning, right? And then it was showing a negative correlation, a significant negative correlation with test anxiety, which we had predicted. So the higher your grit. Oh, and I should mention, grit is really just the ability to kind of overcome setbacks in pursuing your goals and perseverance towards achieving your goals, right? That's how we defined it. And so kids who were kind of grittier were having less test anxiety, which you might expect. So minus 0.39 was the correlation. There's lots of exceptions to the rule, but it's a significant correlation, in the moderate range. So that was evidence for concurrent validity because we assessed all these things at the same time. I'll show you convergent validity. And so I'll take our scores from time 1 and correlate them with the Grit O scale, which was developed by Duckworth. So this is an existing scale that's being very widely used and still is much more used than the scale we developed. So I'll run that. And we get a correlation of 0.41 if we're going to round it up, which isn't like super strong. It's only a moderate correlation. It is statistically significant. Here you can see the p-value is below 0.05. We wouldn't expect a super high correlation. We'd expect a significant correlation, but we define grit differently than Duckworth does. Duckworth has that same kind of perseverance I was talking about, but she also says that there should be a consistency of interest, which we didn't necessarily agree with. I feel like you can be gritty but have a variety of interests. So so we had a different definition, and because of that we operationalized our operational definition was different than hers. So you would expect our scales to be different, and they were, but there was a correlation, a significant correlation nonetheless. So there's some evidence for convergent validity. And then let me see. I'll show you predictive validity. So I'll use scores from time 1 again, and I'm just going to go down here, and this is performance on math, New York State tests, ELA, so English, and science. And there we go. So, significant correlations with math, ELA, and science. So which is great. Like, so how you scored on this grit scale at time 1 was able to actually predict how you would score on these New York State tests. I think one of them was actually taken before they took the grit scale, so it didn't actually predict that one, but I'm forgetting which one now. But otherwise, it was predicting performance on these New York State tests, which is great. Again, it's predicting some real world meaningful outcome. And then I'll lastly show you incremental validity. So we're just going to go to analyze regression and linear. And so in this case, I already entered everything, but here where it says independence, you're putting your predictors in, which would be, in this case, the grit O scale and the GSCA. So our grit scale versus this already established one. Here we're predicting performance on ELA. So that goes into where it says dependent, but it's really like your criterion or your outcome, right? And then we just click OK. And if you scroll down here, you can see that our grit scale emerged as a significant predictor of ELA performance. So, P is 0.01, right, which is below 0.05. But the grit O scale, the Duckworth scale, did not. So you could say our scale predicted ELA performance over and above the grit O scale. So it's showing its added value, or it's demonstrating incremental validity. It's predicting this outcome over and above existing measures or existing predictors. So that is really that, I believe, is there. So we've gone through internal consistency, test, retest reliability, concurrent validity, convergent validity, predictive validity, and finally, incremental validity. So I hope that helps to allow you guys to understand like how we would go about testing for these things in the real world. As you can see, a lot of the statistics are fairly straightforward and things that you would have done in your psych stats course, right? I know that you would have been working with SPSS as well. So yeah, you're often just calculating correlations. This was what we would call a multiple regression, where we had 2 predictors. You wouldn't have done that in your stats class. You would have had 1 predictor, 1 outcome, but still fairly straightforward. I think you would agree. Checking for internal consistency, you probably did that in your stats class as well, but that was very straightforward. So, analyzing the data is fairly simple. Yeah. Anyways, I hope that helped. And I will stop it here.